What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets daytime television's most outspoken host? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with Joy Behar on The View, only to find himself under fire from the very first question. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a full-blown verbal showdown that leaves the entire studio in stunned silence and ends with one of cinema's greatest icons doing something nobody saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. The tension was palpable from the moment Clint Eastwood stepped onto The View's iconic set last night. At 94 years old, the legendary actor and director commanded respect with his weathered presence and piercing stare that has intimidated audiences for decades. But Joy Behar seemed determined to test just how far she could push the man who made Dirty Harry a household name. What started as seemingly standard pleasantries quickly transformed into something far more sinister. As Eastwood settled into his chair, adjusting his signature casual blazer, Behar wasted no time launching into what would become an increasingly hostile interrogation, disguised as an interview. "Clint, it's wonderful to have you here," Behar began with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I have to ask, given your political views over the years, particularly your support for certain controversial figures, how do you reconcile that with making movies that supposedly champion justice and morality?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Eastwood's famous squint intensified as he processed what was clearly an attempt to corner him from the very beginning. The other co-hosts shifted uncomfortably, sensing the confrontational tone that had already infected what should have been a celebration of Eastwood's legendary career. "Well, Joy," Eastwood replied in his trademark gravelly voice, "I've always believed in telling stories that reflect the complexity of human nature. Real justice isn't about political parties. It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult." But Behar wasn't satisfied with diplomatic answers. Leaning forward aggressively, she pressed harder, her voice taking on that sharp edge viewers have come to associate with her most contentious moments. "That's a very convenient way to sidestep the question, don't you think? I mean, when you endorsed Trump, when you made comments about this generation being too soft, those aren't just movie characters talking. That's Clint Eastwood, the man making very real political statements that affect very real people." The atmosphere in the studio grew noticeably heavier. Crew members exchanged glances while the audience sat in uncomfortable silence. Eastwood's jaw tightened, a telltale sign that Behar had struck a nerve, though not in the way she might have intended. "Listen here." Eastwood's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that had terrified countless movie villains. "I've been making pictures for over 6 decades. I've employed thousands of people, told stories that matter, and I've never once asked anyone to think exactly like me. That's called freedom, something this country was built on." Rather than backing down, Behar seemed emboldened by Eastwood's defensive response. Her eyes lit up with the kind of predatory gleam that appears when she senses weakness in her prey. The veteran host had clearly come prepared for battle, armed with talking points designed to provoke rather than illuminate. "Freedom, yes. But don't you think that comes with responsibility?" she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "When you have the platform you have, when you've influenced generations of Americans through your films, don't you have an obligation to use that influence more thoughtfully, especially given some of the more troubling aspects of the political figures you've supported?" The question was loaded with implications and accusations wrapped in the guise of moral concern. Eastwood's legendary composure was being tested by someone who seemed more interested in scoring political points than conducting a genuine conversation. What happened next would become the turning point of the entire confrontation. Eastwood slowly turned to face Behar directly, his steely gaze boring into her with an intensity that had made grown men reconsider their life choices in countless westerns. "You know what I think is troubling?" Eastwood's voice was controlled, but carried an unmistakable edge of mounting anger. "I think it's troubling when someone invites you onto their show supposedly to talk about your work and your life, then spends the whole time trying to lecture you about your personal beliefs like you're some kind of wayward child who needs correcting." The studio fell into an electric silence. Behar's co-hosts looked like they wanted to crawl under the table, while the audience held their collective breath. This wasn't going according to anyone's script, but Joy Behar, true to form, refused to recognize the warning signs that anyone who had watched an Eastwood film would have immediately understood. Instead of de-escalating, she doubled down with the kind of self-righteous indignation that has become her trademark. I'm not lecturing anyone, Clint. I'm asking legitimate questions that I think our viewers deserve answers to. You put yourself in the public arena, you made political endorsements, you made statements about entire generations of Americans. Those actions have consequences, and as a journalist, it's my job to hold public figures accountable. The word journalist seemed to trigger something in Eastwood that no one in the studio was prepared for. His famous restraint finally began to crack, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of cold fury that had made him a legend. Journalist? The way he said the word dripped with contempt. Is that what you call this? Inviting someone on your show just so you can ambush them with your political agenda? I've dealt with real journalists, Joy. People who asked tough questions but showed basic respect for their guests. What you're doing here isn't journalism. It's a hit job. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun. Behar's face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger was impossible to tell. The confrontation had officially moved beyond uncomfortable territory into something resembling all-out warfare. How dare you? Behar's voice cracked with indignation. I've been in this business for decades, and I don't need some Hollywood actor telling me how to do my job. You came on this show knowing exactly what kind of program this island. If you can't handle being asked real questions about your real beliefs, maybe you shouldn't have accepted the invitation. That response proved to be the final straw. Eastwood's famous patience, tested by decades of difficult directors, demanding producers, and hostile critics, finally reached its breaking point. When he stood up from his chair, the movement was so sudden and decisive that it startled everyone in the studio. You know what, Joy? His voice was deadly quiet now, carrying more menace than any shouted threat ever could. You're absolutely right about one thing. I shouldn't have accepted this invitation. I thought I was coming here to have a conversation with a fellow professional. Instead, I find myself being interrogated by someone who's more interested in pushing their political agenda than showing basic courtesy to their guests. The camera captured every nuance of the moment. Behar's shocked expression, the panicked looks on the other co-hosts' faces, the stunned silence from the audience. This wasn't just an uncomfortable interview moment. This was television history being made in real time. Behar, perhaps realizing she had pushed too far, attempted damage control with the kind of backpedaling that rarely works once a situation has spiraled completely out of control. Clint, please sit down. Look, if I came across too strong, that wasn't my intention. But these are important issues that people care about, and no. The single word cut through her attempted explanation like a knife. Eastwood was already removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. I've sat through enough of this. I came here thinking I was going to talk about my new film, maybe share some stories from my career. Instead, you've spent the entire time trying to shame me for my political beliefs. The legendary actor's voice carried decades of authority, earned through one of Hollywood's most distinguished careers. When Clint Eastwood speaks, people listen. But Joy Behar seemed incapable of recognizing when she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. You're being overly sensitive, she protested, her own voice rising as she sensed the interview slipping completely beyond her control. I'm asking you the same questions I'd ask any public figure who— Lady, Eastwood interrupted, his tone now carrying that dangerous edge that had made him one of cinema's most intimidating presences. I've been dealing with critics, reporters, and hostile interviewers since before you were even in this business. I know the difference between tough questions and a coordinated attack. What you've done here today is the latter. As he stood there, microphone in hand, Clint Eastwood embodied every iconic character he had ever played. The Man with No Name, Dirty Harry, William Money, all rolled into one genuinely angry human being who had simply had enough. You want to know what I think is really troubling? His voice carried across the silent studio with crystal clarity. It's that you can't just let people have different opinions without trying to destroy them for it. You can't just disagree. You have to make it personal. You have to make it ugly. That's not journalism, Joy. That's just bullying with better lighting. The accusation of bullying seemed to strike Behar like a physical blow. For perhaps the first time in the entire confrontation, She appeared genuinely speechless, her mouth opening and closing without any words emerging. Eastwood placed his microphone on the side table, with the kind of finality usually reserved for the closing scenes of his films. When he looked up, his gaze swept across the entire panel before settling one final time on his antagonist. "I've made a lot of movies about justice over the years," he said, his voice now carrying that philosophical weight that had made his characters so memorable. "Real justice isn't about destroying people who disagree with you. It's about treating people with basic dignity, even when you think they're wrong. You might want to think about that the next time you invite someone on your show." The silence that followed was deafening. Eastwood began walking toward the exit, his stride confident and unhurried, despite the chaos he was leaving behind. Behar finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate plea rather than the authoritative tone she had wielded throughout the interview. "Clint, please don't leave like this. We can talk about your film. We can." He paused at the edge of the set, turning back one final time with that legendary squint that had intimidated outlaws and corrupt sheriffs across countless movies. "Some conversations," he said with quiet dignity, "just aren't worth having." And with that, Clint Eastwood walked off the View's set, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a humiliated host, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about moments in daytime television history. The man who had spent decades portraying characters who stood up to bullies had just done exactly that in real life, proving that at 94 years old, he was still every bit as formidable as any role he had ever played.